Stewart back with I Object, Justice Examined. And boy, do I have an action-packed show today. First of all, I'm going to have Pastor Chuck Baldwin in for a second time so that we can continue the discussion we started about 2 weeks ago. And then secondly, for the last two segments, I'm going to have Gary Connor on. And probably many of you have never heard of Gary Connor. He is a citizen of Dripping Springs, Texas, who actually took a criminal complaint about public corruption himself to a Travis County grand jury and got some interesting results. So we'll be talking to him later on. But first, I want to introduce my guest, Pastor Chuck Baldwin. Pastor Baldwin is the presidential candidate for the Constitution Party. He's also the founder and minister at the Crossroad Baptist Church in Pensacola, Florida. And under his leadership, his church was recognized by President Ronald Reagan. He has had, unlike many of the other churches where the preachers do not have much courage, he has had many conservative political and values leaders speak in his church, including Patrick J. Buchanan, Pueblo Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Commander Steve Harris, Congressman Joe Scarborough, and Ambassador Alan Keyes, just to name a few. Welcome back to the show, Pastor Baldwin.
Jerry, thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Well, I'm really glad you're back because I was just full of questions during the last show, and we just didn't have time to get them all done. And the first issue that I want to go into is talk a little bit about the Constitution Party itself, because I happened to go to the recent Americans for Prosperity conference that was held here in Austin a few weeks ago, where there were many conservative speakers and many of my fellow Ron Paul supporters were, and we discussed you. Your ears might have been burning, but there were some questions among some of them who do not have the same religious views that you and I have as to whether or not the Constitution Party is a party that supports theocracy. Would you like to discuss that?
Well, that's a criticism that some make, I think, intentionally trying to disparage what we are trying to represent, and then others, I'm sure, that are genuinely concerned from an inquisitive point of view. Let me just set the record straight. The principal liberty upon which America was founded was the freedom of religion. Religious liberty is the central issue that defined our freedoms in this country. In fact, it's no accident that religious liberty is codified under our Constitution in the very First Amendment. Now, there's a reason for that. The Founding Fathers made it crystal clear that they wanted a nation that would respect the religious liberty of all of its citizens. And interestingly enough, for those who know history well enough will remember this, that the First Amendment to the Constitution was actually the brainchild of a Baptist minister by the name of John Leland. John Leland had been persecuted for his faith during the early days of colonial America, as had many other ministers of the gospel. There were certain quarters of our society back at that time that were not very tolerant of those denominations that were not part of the established church.
Yeah.
And so it was very important to the colonists and to James Madison and John Leland and the other founders that we have codified in our Constitution religious liberty. And so I'm committed deeply to that principle. So whether a person chooses to worship as I do or not is irrelevant. Whether a person chooses to not worship at all, if a person is an atheist or agnostic who chooses not to go to church at all, as far as our liberties are concerned, we must respect the freedoms of all Americans, and that means the freedom to worship or not worship as we see fit. And I am committed to religious liberty, and so is our party.
Well, one thing that I wanted to do is draw the parallel between Christianity and individual liberty, because one of my favorite theologians is Rousseau John Rushdoony, and he wrote that he wrote what the definition of theocracy actually is, and he wrote that theocracy is not some top-down top rule where the elite religious leaders lord over the others, but rather theocracy is the self-governance of the individual man. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, I agree with that. And our nation is an experiment in self-government. And without that principle at our core, then we cease to exist as a free and independent nation. And so for those out there who think, well, because I'm a Christian and because I'm a Baptist minister, that somehow or another I would use a political office to coerce people to worship as I do, is absolutely ludicrous. They do not know me at all that would think that. In fact, I am one who has, over the last few years, publicly, actively opposed President Bush's faith-based initiatives. Now, here I am as a Christian minister, and I am actively opposed to what George W. Bush instituted under his administration, the so-called faith-based initiatives, whereby he would take tax dollars and give those to religious organizations. And I oppose that from many perspectives, not the least of which was it violates the principle of the First Amendment, which would take away the freedom from those institutions to administer whatever faith system they choose to administer without government support or government fetters. And the requirements of the of faith-based initiative violate that principle on both ends of the spectrum. So you're talking to a guy here who actually opposed faith-based initiatives, whereas many of my evangelical brethren were, actively supporting it. But so people need to understand that we believe in religious liberty. We believe in the freedom of everyone to worship or not worship as they see fit.
Well, I think one thing that really interests me, because I totally agree with you on the faith-based initiatives, because I know what sort of power government money exerts over any entity that is given that money through regulation. And to me, the thought that civil government would in any way regulate a church or a faith-based ministry is horrifying to me. I don't know. Have you ever read the book Hitler's Cross about how Hitler's government co-opted the churches?
I have given away scores of that book, and I have written about it in my columns. I've said if you don't read any book other than the Bible, read Hitler's Cross. It's absolutely critical that everyone read that book. You're exactly right.
And why don't you explain to everyone why you think they should read that book and what it means for us as the government expands its power even into the churches and ministries?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Erwin Lutzer, who wrote the book back in 1995, he wrote from the perspective of what was happening in Germany among the churches as Hitler came into power. It was a very interesting perspective. Most perspectives are secular, or they're talking about the economy, or they talk about politics or military. But his book focused on the churches. There were 14,000 evangelical churches in Germany at the time when the Third Reich came into being. And he talked about, what happened? How did the Nazi Party ingratiate itself to the churches of Germany? What was the reaction of the pastors? And how did this all take place? And that was kind of the theme of his book. And he takes us on a journey, and he shows us how that the Nazi Party, and Hitler in particular, were able to convince the German people that by supporting their party and supporting their candidate, Adolf Hitler, they were actually supporting God, and they integrated God with the political party, and they equated the Nazi Party with Christianity. In fact, there's pictures in the book that Lutzer has of showing the Nazi flag, and in the middle of the flag, you'll see sewed into the fabric the cross. And what he did is he equated Christianity with the Nazi Party and vice versa, and he integrated those concepts. So in order to be a good Christian, you had to be a good German. And I mean, a good Nazi. And to be a good German, you had to be a good Nazi. And the whole thing was integrated and woven together very, very brilliantly by Hitler's spinmeisters. The result was, of the 14,000 evangelical pastors in Germany at the time, only 800 did not support Adolf Hitler, and that's how Hitler was able to really, take control of Germany. He used the churches to do it. And so, yeah.
That is a continuing story of civil government trying to gain control over the church. And I don't mean to interrupt you. We'll go back to that, but we've actually got a caller who wants to ask you a question. We've got Erica from Texas.
Hello.
Erica?
Hi, Jerri.
Hi, Erica.
Hi, Chuck.
Thanks for calling in, Erica. Erica actually is a very active Ron Paul supporter, and so I'm sure she's got some good questions to ask here.
Okay. Well, Jerri already asked you exactly what I was going to ask you, so I guess I'll shift gears a little bit. I wanted to ask you about the economy. I see a lot of bad news in the economy and the failing dollar. What kind of policies, or what would you do, if anything, if you were elected as president to help strengthen the dollar and rescue our economy?
Right, thank you. Well, you should know that I supported Ron Paul during the primary very actively. I traveled with him in Iowa, and I was with him in South Carolina. I actively promoted his candidacy. I'm a syndicated columnist, and I use my columns on many occasions to promote his candidacy. He and I are friends, and he said some very kind things about me here recently on national news. So, if Ron Paul had become the nominee of the Republican Party, in all likelihood, I would not be doing what I'm doing today. So you need to know where I'm coming from. When it comes to the economy, I concur with Ron's approach. I really believe that the problem that we have economically today is because of the Federal Reserve System and the way that our leaders have taken America away from sound money principles. Dr. Paul is absolutely right on this score. I really firmly believe that we must get rid of the IRS. We must overturn the 16th Amendment. We must do something to wean America off of the Federal Reserve System. What we have going on here is simply a manipulation of the economy by the feds in a manner in which has reduced the dollar and the significance of the dollar to the point that all these other matters have arisen as they have. I have this fantasy where I have just appointed Ron Paul as the Secretary of the Treasury.
Well, yay!
Of the United States.
That would be wonderful.
I just fantasize about that because I think, all the things that he's talked about are the things that are absolutely necessary. We've got to get back to sound money. We've got to get back to hard currency. We've got to get rid of this, printing money out of thin air, fiat money supply, which does nothing except reduce the cost or the price of the value of the dollar and raises the cost of everything else. So I really believe that his approach is the right approach. He's already put together a plan in which we would, in a step-by-step process, wean ourselves off of the Federal Reserve System. And I would, as president, give his approach prime consideration, and I would do everything in my power as president to accomplish that.
Well, Eric, I want to thank you for your question, and if you don't have any more, I'm going to go on to something else a little bit more specific about the economy. Erica, did you have any other questions?
I just can I plug my meetup group that I started?
Yes, you may. You certainly may.
Okay, I was really excited to join the Constitution Party a couple of weeks ago when I started a Constitution Party meetup group, and it's called the Central Texas Chuck Baldwin 2008 Meetup Group, and the website is constitutionparty.meetup/189.
That's great. Well, thanks, Erica, and Chuck, it looks like you've got some grassroots swell going on in the same manner as Ron Paul here.
Well, in fact, many of our supporters have come from the Ron Paul campaign, and Erica, thank you very much for what you're doing there in Texas. I appreciate you very much.
Well, Chuck, I want to kind of go off on another or drill in on this these questions about the economy, because this morning as I was driving to work, I was listening to NPR, and yes, I actually listen to NPR on occasion, and they were claiming that whereas a few years ago polls showed that the majority of Americans did not favor government intervention into the economy, that with regard to Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and what is going on here with the Fed's increasing regulation, that slightly more than a majority now favors that. What do you have to say about how the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac situation should be handled, and how can we get people back on track and educate them about how destructive these regulations are?
The worst thing we can do is turn more control over to the government, and unfortunately what we have going on here is a pattern, and I've seen this, and you have too. You follow this like I do, and what we have, first of all, is I believe a government-created crisis for the express purpose of the government's coming in as the 7th Cavalry to rescue everybody from the crisis. First they create the crisis, and then they say, well, here we are to help you out of your crisis, when the fact of the matter is that there wouldn't have been a crisis if they would not have created it to begin with. And I think that's what we see going on here with the economy. We've got a Federal Reserve System that has for years and years abused sound money principles. The problem is not that there's not enough money going into Washington, D.C. My dad had a saying years ago. He would say, son, if your outgo exceeds your income, your upkeep will be your downfall. And, that's true whether you're an individual, whether you're a corporation, whether you have a government, state, local, doesn't matter. That principle applies. The problem is not that we don't have enough money coming into Washington. The problem is we have people in Washington, D.C. that have absolutely no control over spending. I mean, look at what George W. Bush has done and the Republicans in the area of spending ever since they took over in 2000. They had the entire federal government from 2000 to 2006 under their control. What did they do? They spent money like drunken sailors, and that's an insult to sailors, because at least sailors spend their own money. Exactly. And you got to go back to Lyndon Baines Johnson to match the kind of spending. We're talking about not just on the war in Iraq either. We're talking about discretionary domestic spending, as has the Republicans and President Bush. So the problem is that these people have absolutely no control whatsoever of spending at the federal level. And so that's why I say that we've got to, first of all, we've got to get the income tax situation, we got to work this out. We've got to get the Americans set free from this direct, unconstitutional, excessive income tax. Get people into a production mode again. Bring our jobs back to America. And at the same time as we are taking the income tax away and the Internal Revenue Service, we replace it with an across-the-board now, not a protective, but an across-the-board 10% tariff on all imports coming into the United States. Now, that matches the constitutional prescription for funding of the federal government. And remember, we've reduced spending. We've gotten rid of the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, all these. Remember back in 1994, whenever Newt Gingrich said, elect us, and we're going to get rid of 5 federal departments. Yeah. You remember that? Well, yes. We elected them to the House and Senate, but what did they do? Not only did they not get rid of any of those departments, they turned around and increased funding and continue to do so ever since. I would eliminate those same federal departments. We would slash spending. We would go to a 10% general tariff, and we would bring government spending under control. And when you do that, you're going to get the economy under control.
Well, those sound like some great plans, and we've got more to discuss on the other side of the break. We're coming up on a hard break, and I want to discuss your ideas a little bit more and go into American sovereignty and some of the writings that you have sent out just lately. So please stay over, and everybody stay tuned for some more interview of Pastor Chuck Baldwin, who I hope will be our next president.